get going. Thank you so much, Eloise, for all your awesome organizing. All right. So, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar, Bridging Content Divides in Instruction, Physical and Digital Materials. The idea for this webinar mini-series, of which this is one part of two, grew out of the continued curricular trend away from strict disciplinary silos towards more interdisciplinary course offerings, necessitating a parallel de-siloing, official or otherwise, on the part of academic libraries. Particularly relevant to today's session, I will point out that the Ithaca SNR report on primary source instruction released last year noted that faculty see physical and digital sources as complementary, not competing, which suggests we may want to start viewing those sources similarly. But how then do we do that in the classroom? Usually our greatest point of contact with faculty and students. My name is Anna Franz. I'm the Assistant Head of Access Services at Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, Yale University, which is located on the ancestral land of the Quinnipiac and other Algonquian-speaking peoples. I serve on the Instruction and Outreach Committee of the Rare Book and Manuscript section of ACRL. I will moderate today's session, assisted by fellow committee member Adam Beauchamp, Humanities Librarian at the Florida State University Libraries, located on the ancestral and traditional territory of the Appalachian Nation, the Muscogee Creek Nation, the Miccosukee Tribe of Florida, and the Seminole Tribe of Florida. Addressing our topic today are Kara Flynn and Neil Weijer. Kara Flynn is the Education and Engagement Archivist in the Special Collections Division at the University of Arkansas Libraries on the ancestral lands of the Osage, Caddo, and Quapaw nations, and is a site through which passed the nations forced along the Trail of Tears. Kara leads the exhibits team, facilitates the Special Collections Graduate Student Speaker Series, and regularly provides primary source instruction for undergraduate courses in a range of disciplines. Her research interests include archival outreach, teaching with primary sources, and archival education. Neil Weijer is curator of the University of Florida's Harold and Mary Jean Hansen Rare Book Collection. The University of Florida is located on the historic territories of the Timucua and sits at a crossroads of the Native American peoples who long lived there. Since 2019, Neil has worked to develop and promote the collection to engage students and faculty on campus and around the state, increasingly in digital spaces. He also directs the project Storied Books at the University of Florida, which sponsors and showcases student research and experimentation in the university's collections. His research focuses on the history of early books and manuscripts, and especially on the intersections between legendary history, forgery, and scholarly practice in medieval and early modern England. They'll both speak for about 15 minutes, at which point we will open up for questions. Feel free to use either the chat or the Q&A function. Adam will be monitoring both while I moderate. And with that, Kara, the screen is yours.
A little bit of technical difficulty, even though we just tested this. All right, can everybody see my slides okay? Great. All right, so hi everybody. I am going to, like Anna said, my name is Kara Flynn. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Education and Engagement Archivist at the University of Arkansas Libraries Special Collections. And today I'm going to be talking about taking a needs-based approach to using physical and digital materials in special collections instruction. So first, I'm going to give a bit of background on my own experiences with primary source instruction. I'll talk a little bit about why I've chosen to use a mix of physical and digital primary sources. And then I'll walk you through 2 examples of what this looks like for me in practice. So like I said, before we get into things, I wanted to give a little bit of background about myself and my experience with instruction, because it's really informed the way that I use a mix of primary and primary sources, both in digital and physical forms. So I've been doing primary source instruction for about 4.5, 5 years now. And the different environments in which I've done this instruction has really influenced the way that I teach. So I've been doing primary source instruction in 2 different academic environments. Initially, when I first got my MLIS, I was working at a small branch campus of a large university system, and I was the sole special collections librarian and also a liaison librarian to multiple departments. And we had a relatively small number of collections digitized in that special collections environment. And so that kind of influenced the way that I was doing my instruction there. We had a lot of commuter students and non-traditional students. And now for the past almost 3 years, I've been here at the University of Arkansas, which is the flagship university in the University of Arkansas system. It has a much more traditional student population. And we have a really large special collections staff and healthy digitization program here. So we have a lot of digital collections from our own collections. In terms of the sort of type of instruction that I tend to do, I generally try to avoid show and tell sessions when I can. Sometimes that's what an instructor wants, but I prefer active learning when I can sneak it in. And especially in the last year or so, I've been learning a lot more about anti-racist and decolonizing pedagogy. And I've been trying to implement some of those changes to my instruction as I move forward. I'm by no means an expert in this area, but I wanted to include it in my bit of background before jumping into how and why I use this mix of materials. So I actually started teaching with a mix of hybrid materials before the pandemic started. So that's kind of what I've been asked to talk about today, is kind of why I made that decision prior to sort of circumstances changing in the pandemic and some of us being forced into using digital primary sources more. And then I'll get into my examples. So as I mentioned earlier, my instruction is really influenced by the kind of environment that I'm in and the students that I'm working with. So like I said, in my previous institution, this included many non-traditional students who weren't necessarily able to visit special collections during our open hours, which coincide with traditional business hours. And so I was working with a mix of digital and physical materials as a way to address concerns around physical access for those students in my previous institution. And in my current position, I work with a lot of different disciplines. Oops, I just skipped a slide. I work with a lot of different disciplines in my current role, and most of them are not history students. So they're not necessarily going to need to visit special collections multiple times throughout their college career or for their major. And so I've learned to really tailor my instruction specifically to the types of students I'm working with, because I really want to get them the resources they need. And I understand that not every student is a history major or is going to go on to become an archivist like I did. So that's another kind of part of why I had started working with hybrid materials when I got here. Additionally, because I work with this wide range of students and disciplines. They have really diverse research needs, and I can kind of supplement physical materials with digital materials. It also helps me to address gaps in collecting areas and allows for a diversity of resources, both for diversity in terms of representation, but also in terms of diversity of research topics and even ways of searching or interacting with primary sources. So for example, I work regularly with printmaking students, and they are looking for different things and are searching in different ways because they're using primary sources primarily as a visual medium to influence their work in their discipline. Whereas educational studies majors that I am doing instruction sessions with are writing traditional research papers on American educational history. And so their search terms that they're going to be using, the types of primary sources they're going to be looking for might be slightly different, and they'll also be focusing more on the written content of those items. And then in terms of digital materials, I use a mix of digital collections, both from my institution, as well as digital primary sources from other outside sources, like Digital Public Library of America is a big one I use a lot, World Digital Library, Library of Congress, all those kinds of places. Additionally, I have found that moving kind of away from exclusively physical materials and towards a mix of materials has helped me to avoid overemphasizing physical items. I don't personally subscribe to an overemphasis on physical items because I feel that it perpetuates vocational awe, which is problematic. And it means that I don't have to rely as much on sort of the mystique of physical items when I'm trying to get students interested in researching with primary sources. I've found that especially using digital materials helps me to get students interested in primary sources from kind of a variety of different pathways, because like I said earlier, not every student is going to be an archivist. For me, my first instruction session when I was an undergraduate student and I went to special collections for the first time was like life-changing. It put me on this path, but that's not most students. And a lot of students prefer using digital materials, so it makes it a little bit more accessible to them that way too. And finally, a lot of my early instruction focused on item analysis with physical items, but I realized this wasn't really teaching students the skills they needed to conduct research and find primary sources on their own. And so combining physical and digital sources has also helped me to make more explicit connections between online searching skills, like through a digital collection or even a finding aid, with that close reading of a primary source in either format. So I'm a very process-oriented person, and so I wanted to include this slide, but I realized that for many of us, we have our own processes for planning instruction, and your process may look similar to this one. But I wanted to kind of point to a couple of points in the process where I think, I guess, intentionally about how I'm going to be using both physical and digital materials. So my first step, the gathering data step, this is the sort of period of time in which I'd be emailing with an instructor or meeting with an instructor to find out what the overall goals of the course are, what they want the students to get out of an instruction session, what kind of students tend to take the class. So this could be like major or other demographic information that would be important for me to know. And then if there are any assignments associated with the class, all that stuff. In step 2, I look at our collections to see what formats are going to best support student needs, and then what collections, both physical and digital, do we have access to or that will fulfill those needs, and then thinking about any gaps in the types of materials available in either format and how kind of mixing those together can help address those gaps. In designing the class, I'm thinking about learning objectives, what I want the session to look like structurally. So if there are specific activities I want them to be able to do. And then this is the part of the process where I ask myself why it's important that students are using both physical and digital objects, and how do I want them to go about reflecting on the similarities and differences of using these two different types of primary sources. And then finally, implementing and iterating. So you do the session. I usually collect some kind of student feedback or assessment. And then I use that to adapt for future sessions, because a lot of the instruction sessions I do, I'll either do them for the same course over and over again, semester after semester, or I will work with the same professor repeatedly when they're teaching maybe slightly different, but relatively similar courses. So I want to use the remainder of my time to walk you through two examples of what this looks like in practice. So this course is a script analysis course. So this is in the theater department. And also in terms of the slides for these examples, they're both formatted the same way. So I'll talk about kind of the activities associated with the session, the materials that were used, learning objectives. I'm not really going to go through the learning objectives, but if you're interested, I plan instruction around the guidelines for primary source literacy developed by SIA and RBMS, I think in 2018. So that's where these learning objectives come from. And then I have the kind of some collections that I use in each session. So for this course, students spend the semester reading and analyzing plays, and their big semester-long assignment is a production pitch, which includes both a written report as well as a presentation in front of their classmates, where they have to pick a play to adapt, and then they sort of describe the choices they would make in that adaptation and why. So this includes things like characterization, casting, costume design, lighting design, set design. And for this class, I specifically select collections that have a digital collection counterpart. So I pull the physical boxes of the physical materials for each collection, and I narrow my kind of search of collections, I guess, specifically to collections that have a digital collection counterpart in our instance of Content DM, so that students can experience using materials in both physical and digital format that are all from the same collection. So in terms of what the instruction session looks like, I use a flipped classroom model using a module that I made in LibWizard. So basically there's a brief video that students watch ahead of class that kind of guides them on how to navigate our digital collections. And then they complete an activity in that LibWizard module that basically asks them to search for and find a digital item in a given collection. They can pick the collection that it came from, and then collect some information about that using the item record. So this has been really helpful. As you all know, we mostly do one-shots, or at least I mostly do one-shots. And so I don't have a lot of time with these students, and I want them to get the most out of their class time. So this has been really helpful, especially at the top of class, because I've had a chance to look at their answers to the activity ahead of time. And so I can kind of pinpoint areas where maybe we need some clarification or a little bit more information, or where there might be questions. And then we jump right into the activity for the in-class part of the session. And so once we're in class together, I break the students into small groups, and each group gets a box of physical materials to look through. And they basically are asked to use the archival materials that they have in front of them to brainstorm a production pitch for a play of their choice and discuss how the collection would influence choices around costuming, set design, lighting design, characterization, and there's a few other questions in there as well. I've used both paper forms as well as Padlet. I really like Padlet, so that's what I've been using for the last couple of semesters to have them record their answers to there's sort of a discussion question handout that I used to use just a paper version. Now it's on Padlet. And so that kind of guides their group work and makes sure that they get through the various aspects of a production pitch. And then they work together to discuss and kind of formulate their production pitch. And then the sort of second half of the questions in either the paper handout or on Padlet, they are given the link to the digital collection, and then they're asked to reflect on a few more questions about using digital materials from the same collection before we come back together and each group, I have one person from each group share a little bit about essentially summarize their production pitch for their classmates and share a little bit about the process of looking at both the physical and digital collection. Because the digital collections include a landing page with background information, as well as metadata for each digital item in the individual item records, students are often able to better understand what they were looking at by consulting the digital collection. I also linked to the finding aid, although they use the finding aid less often than they use the digital collection information. And it also helps them make sense of the physical content better. For example, we use some 19th century collections for this activity, and students often struggle to read the handwriting of letters and diaries and things, and those materials have transcripts in the digital collection. And so that's come up multiple semesters in a row with different groups of students as being particularly helpful, that if they're looking at some kind of physical item, then they can go to the digital collection to make more sense of that item, even just in terms of the content, in terms of transcription. So I use a variety of different collections for this. Every semester I pick different ones, but these are some of the collections that I've used in the past. So my second example before I turn it over to Neil is I have repeatedly worked with a couple of different courses in political science, but I wanted to pinpoint African American politics for this example. So this is a course that political science majors generally take. It's more juniors and seniors taking this course, so upper level political science majors. And these courses can be really large. So they're some of the biggest courses that I've worked with, sometimes as many as 75 students. And so it's a little bit hard to do primary source instruction to that big of a group, but usually they're around 30 to 40. So I've adapted similar activities to this one for a couple of different courses, but I have used a pop-up exhibit activity repeatedly. So sometimes this is a pop-up exhibit that I've curated. So for more introductory political science courses, I will include like bumper stickers and campaign buttons and flyers, and we'll talk about campaigning. But this example, like I said, it's from this upper division course. And so I developed a pop-up exhibit activity actually based on an exhibit that we had done in a previous semester, a longer term exhibit. And it was focused on the Elaine massacre, which occurred in the summer of 1918 in southern Arkansas. And it was kind of overlooked in history for many years. There's been a resurgence in the last decade or two of researchers like really digging into this topic. And so it's a really interesting historical event and part of Arkansas history that ties really closely with African American politics, especially in the state. So I was able to reuse several items that had been on display previously, as well as some exhibit labels. And so I had students come up in small groups and take a tour of the Popup exhibit, which I set up in front of the classroom on a table. And then they had, like 20 minutes or so for all of them to circulate through that. And then after they sat back down, I asked just one or two groups to recap their experience and talk a little bit about what they looked at. And then in front of the whole class, I do a guided walkthrough of digital collections that are related to African American politics more generally. So if they were, interested in some of the materials they saw in this collection, they can find additional information in the digital collections. And then I have somebody from the class pick an item as we're scrolling through items in digital collections, and then we do kind of a group analysis of that digital item, and that's where I would talk to them about like controlled vocabularies and search terms and things like that. So this course doesn't have a specific assignment associated with it, but students are encouraged to use primary sources in their research papers as their upperclassmen. And so this is kind of a general introduction. And then to make sure I get some reflection in there from the students, I asked them to do an exit question. So usually it'll be something related to similarities and differences of viewing the pop-up exhibit activity versus viewing an item in the digital collection. And I'll have them write an answer to that exit question on a note card on the way out of class. And because these are short classes and pretty large. So this is a bit more of a general overview. All right, and that's all I have for my slides. So I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Kara. And yes, as Adam put in the chat, we have questions, but we will save those for the end. So go for it, Neil.
All right, well, thank you, Anna. Can everybody hear me okay?
Sounds good.
All right, great. And let me share this and start going. All right, wonderful. So thank you to Anna and Adam for hosting this and for that wonderful introduction, and also to Kara for walking through that process. I'm going to do something similar today in my time. I'm going to talk about a little bit of the process for blending these materials, and then kind of some of the considerations that we've had here at the University of Florida. So let me get going. So like Anna said, I've been here at the university since 2019. I came from a PhD and a postdoc background, so not necessarily from libraries, although I've worked in them now for quite some time. And so what I'm going to offer today is just an overview of the local conditions here at UF, and then some of the ways that we've combined physical and digital instruction outside, around the classroom, within the classroom, and then finally, kind of thinking about how we extend the classroom beyond the library, or we extend our spaces, our library spaces, beyond our own building, which is one of several libraries on the UF campus, which is sprawling, in contrast to the place where I've worked before. Last, I'm going to offer a few tips for planning sessions, and those will kind of talk a little bit about your own content as well as the needs of different spaces. So, like I said, let me see if I'm just going to minimize my Zoom window here too. So, if anything goes wrong, just yell at me. But other than that, get started. So, here at the University of Florida, the Rare Book collection is one of more than a dozen different individually curated collections. So mine certainly doesn't deal with archival material, and it's not even the only one that deals with rare print. It covers the late Middle Ages to the present day, and we do get a very wide range of demands across our courses. One of the things that I realized when we got here is that we had very multi-purpose teaching spaces with no ability to install permanent AV in the main one that we used. So before the pandemic, we were mostly using a 30-person seminar room with no integrated technology that doubled as both a rare book space for one of our other collections as a public space. So it wasn't something that we could really modify. Our other instruction space now, following the pandemic, is a 200+ seat lecture room. So it has AV, but it has a different set of complications. So we also, across these collections, and rare books here is especially into this, we have very varied amounts of digital content. So some collections have either exhibits or subsets of their materials that have been actively digitized for a while. We've had a digitization program here that runs on regional focuses and then also outside grants. But personally, for rare books, there wasn't a whole lot of material that was available online from my own collections. So when I'm talking about blending physical and digital objects, I'm often talking about blending other people's stuff with the materials that are here in the building at the university. We have, class demands, like I said, crossing many different subject areas. We have programs in the graphic arts, English, history, philosophy, anthropology, and some of the STEM disciplines are increasingly coming to visit the collections. We also have large kind of survey programs in the humanities that are interdisciplinary that we are looking to, more fully integrate into the library education curriculum. The problem with this is that the classes are fairly big. So our average class size is somewhere between 20 and 30 students. We do get smaller, advanced level seminars, but even an upper level survey is more than 20 people. And that is about the size that our primary instruction room can comfortably hold. So in short, the habit that most curators and faculty members who are using the collections had when I got here, and in my previous experience, was that library visits would be almost entirely analog. We would suggest that people could take pictures, but any sort of involvement with the materials needed to kind of happen. It had to be built into the course assignment, had to be built into outside activities, or it needed to be really rigorously incorporated into the class. So in 2020, we got a crash course in going entirely digital. Basically, this gave us an excuse to buy a lot more technology that we could use to actually teach with these materials and investigate the ways that we could do that. We did this by conducting outreach and trying to pre-record presentations that replicated part of an in-person visit. Kind of like Kara was saying, a lot of the students and faculty who came to use our collections were not necessarily expecting introductions to research from this collection, particularly from the book collections. They were expecting material that was dovetailing with the content of their syllabus for the course, possibly for the week. So our sessions were largely one-off, and they were also, very, they had to be very strongly related to the content that was being offered. And working through that in the digital space kind of gave us some ways to think about cutting down that material and really focusing in on what we wanted to ask students to do. My own goals when people come in, I mentioned that I have this, the program that I started here is really to get undergraduates especially involved in the collections and give them the ability to do something as part of their course or during their time at the university with the materials that we hold here. Whether those are early materials like the ones that I specialize in, or whether they're things that go up to the present day. So what we were able to record were mixes of video and still images, which by and large, as the pandemic kind of wound down, have transitioned into pre-work for classes. We've been able to kind of use these to introduce students to the materials that they will encounter in person in a class setting. This is particularly useful for me because, like I said, a lot of instructors are tailoring with us the material to a topic, but for many of our classes, this will be the first time a student has come into the collections. It will be certainly the first time they're seeing materials from the collection, possibly, you know, that material at all. And this just gives us a way of introducing them to something before they see it. So our pre-recorded videos have eventually gravitated towards introductions to a topic or a genre. And a lot of them have come to focus on single objects, like this chronicle that you see here, which is a masterpiece of really scrappy early printing that can serve a wide range of both sort of material, methodological, and also sort of book historical purposes. So an introduction can sort of be a little bit more multi-purpose. Sharing these depends on your organization, I will say. Most of ours are hosted internally and then embedded into Canvas pages, although some of the content that we've produced, particularly short introductions, has been made publicly available on our YouTube page. So once we have those links, we can send materials, basically designing classes around things that we know students will have encountered. So now I'll talk a little bit about in-class uses for this technology, because UF fairly early on mandated in-person options, starting with HighFlex in spring of 2021 and continuing to primarily in-person in the fall of 2021. However, they were always pretty adamant that we offer students the opportunity, if they need, to take their course content without losing credit if they can't attend in person. And so for this, we ended up with situations where the digital component of our class might be the material, or it might be some of the students. And that was something that was definitely, you know, having to navigate that during the pandemic has kind of moved forward into our current in-person instruction sessions. So the ways that we've done that, really, I mentioned we have larger classes. What we'll end up doing, since we mostly would project materials for the start of a class for an introduction session or through a recorded session through Zoom, we now have the capability to do that permanently in our large room and with a roll-in monitor and a laptop and a projector on or directly wired to the monitor in our smaller teaching space. So if we know that a section is going to have an in-person and a hybrid component, we will make sure that we do at least a part of that visit through the projector so that, one, the entire class can see a specific object, and then also that we know the people attending have the option to share that experience with the class. As our classrooms have kind of integrated more, we've been able to co-teach. Like I mentioned, we do have a lot of different collections and a lot of different curators. So that has sometimes led to having an all digital exercise or a digital component to an exercise that students can undertake directed by one of the curators who is sitting at the terminal, while the other one kind of has the open-ended exploration during the room. I will say that in these scenarios, coordination with the instructors and managing expectations primarily is key. A lot of the instructors who came in still wanted to be open-ended and flexible with what their students could do, but we really needed to give them concrete aims and limits for what they were proposing. Kara's covered this in her workflow, but I mean, really when you're talking about giving students the ability to view these different types of materials in different places, there's a lot more technology and planning involved. So since technology is now more of a permanent part of our classrooms, we've actually been able to incorporate some of our online activities into things that happen on a monitor or in groups. So I'll use materials that we have in the collections to compare across collections, digitized collections in other repositories around the country and the world. This was an exercise that started online with a printed book of hours. You can see as we scroll across the different changes in rubrication and even the different changes in ornament that we can offer students when they engage with this book in person. And we can also show them, the image on the far right is a manuscript that was designed by the same illustrator who made the cuts for the miniatures. So we can kind of show them more than we can in our own home collections. And we can actually kind of reinforce some of the points that we want students to take away from traditional, classes that talk about the history of the book or talk about the variability of these objects. We've been able to really kind of ramp this up and make our in-person instruction more focused around a particular topic by bringing in these other materials. We've also designed classes where we will look to use the physical experience as a way of bringing people out into research collections. So a physical book that has a lot of annotations, like this copy of an 18th century book that you see here in our collections features, or things like newspapers and ephemera, are sources that students intuit. They're sources that students are, comfortable experiencing digitally, but may never have seen or had to puzzle out in person. And so if I know that there's a class, for example, that will use periodical material or newspapers, I will try to have them start with a physical copy of a historic newspaper so that when they go out into databases, they will be able to actually kind of explore them on their own. And for newspapers, there are plenty of databases that are available, like Chronicling America. And then there are also internal resources across our collections at UF that I know students will end up using. So again, if the goal is to make sure that students particularly, feel comfortable using this material on their own, this is a good first step. And it's a good way to get them thinking about the connections between these objects. I've talked about space, but kind of like Kara, I'm also increasingly a fan of Padlet. This is an example of an exercise that we usually do where we will have an instructor assign a reflection post in Canvas to be completed the week that the students visit about something that they saw or something that they experienced from the session. We've been able to use our monitors and projectors to actually bring this discussion live into a classroom. So this is a class that really wanted a whole bunch of different investigations. They were exploring some of our physical exhibits and our physical spaces, as well as collections. And when the instructor said, I want the students to discuss these in class at the end of the, session, I thought, well, we need to have a way that people can actually show somebody what they've seen, or a way that the instructor or myself or any of the other curators can actually kind of follow along with what they're viewing. So this has been, I think, a really good outcome, a really good extension of the need to incorporate digital material and digital approaches more thoroughly into our collections. So the last thing that I'd like to talk about very briefly is how this extends outside of the library. So this kind of will get into, I think, a little bit of what the next item in the webinar will be. But a lot of the standalone content that we use to bookcase our instruction has given us the ability to reach students out on the campus, students who may never come into our particular library building or would have no reason to do so if the class wouldn't bring them in. So One of the things that we were able to do, since I mentioned there are a number of different library spaces in the collections here or on the campus here, is bring our special collections materials outside of the library and incorporate them into displays and exhibits that are held in less secure areas. So we've used QR codes and facsimiles to do this, combined with either video content or digital spaces that we've created. So in this case, for this exhibit, which was designed for National Poetry Month, the idea was not to bring just the materials, but also some of the readings from the books into the display space. And giving the students the ability to do that through their phones was a real, was the way that we accomplished that. In general, I think QR codes are very good for, if used with some discretion, for spotlighting a particular resource or a particular piece of content that you want students to experience in the classroom or in the moment if you don't have the capability to set something up ahead of time. One of the other great things about this is that these instructions, these components give more concrete links back to our library. So for example, a take-home activity that has students making tunnel books contains not only a how-to video, but an instructional video, a background video on the content and the development of that book shown through our collections. We end up, showcasing these because we can never really resist the opportunity for a good pun. Our department, the Special and Area Studies Department, also known as SASC, now has a channel for some of this public content, Sasquatch, which we can actually use to grow and to refer back to. So I think one of the great things about having this is really just saying, well, we don't have to limit ourselves to what's in the library, both as Kara was saying for vocational law purposes, but also just because we can collaborate more actively and effectively with other people if we're not beholden to our physical space. So last, I'd just like to offer you a few tips for planning some of these exercises and activities, especially when it comes to recording video content or designing some of these spaces. It is time intensive, it is labor intensive. And so we wanna make sure that when you're doing that, you're getting the most out of your own effort. So with the video segments, like I said, you're kind of thinking small. You're thinking in terms of one object, but also the broad applications of that object. So one of the things I think you can start with, and I know I do, is that we all have materials that get pulled all the time that we know that we love to talk about. And we think about ways to, both introduce them generically and leave plenty of spaces open in the introduction for a class to pick up. So that way, if you're introducing students to a particular object or a collection, you can do it quickly. Instructors have become a lot more happy with embedding video content into their Canvas sites, into their courses. And you can do some of the work of showing a student an object or getting them familiarized with it without them having to be there. If you're approaching an instructor and thinking about designing a virtual, a physical and digital class, it's best to build on a model that instructor is familiar with. So if they're used to assigning short discussions or short research activities, you can suggest a specific resource that you might want to focus on for that class. You might want to help them plan their responses, and really, again, working with them ahead of time is absolutely key. We've been doing this for the classes that are for non-majors, but tend to repeat year after year. So if there are courses or instructors that you know and feel comfortable working with, those are very good people to approach. Plan your spaces means not just sort of figuring out how many people will fit in a room or around a particular object, how much material you need to accommodate group work, but if you're thinking about technology, how it will work, particularly who will operate it, how people will move from one platform to another, and whether students actually need computers, phones, what type of accommodations that they will need to have. Our own spaces, like I said, are largely limited to the technology that people can hold in their hands, especially our smaller seminar rooms. And so adding a digital component often means adding more personnel or taking away a lot of the material. Finally, using teams and groups is a way to increase the number of eyes and screens that we have available. Our classes have become increasingly technology heavy, and I think that's a good thing. If students always have phones on, then we can always kind of help them access information and get to it in a way that we haven't before. And with that, I will stop and turn the floor over for questions. Thank you very much.
All right, wonderful. Thank you both. As usual, there are so many questions, so little time. I'll start with several questions sort of orbiting around the assignments, pre-work, feedback. Are any of the assignments graded? How successful are you at getting students to do pre-work or getting them to give you feedback afterwards? Sort of what have you found effective in those arenas?
I'll jump in first, I guess. So for pre-work, for the kind of like flipped classroom thing that I do where they are assigned a module, initially we had pretty good, the first semester we had pretty good completion rates, but I've worked with that professor for like 4 or 5 semesters now, and he started just for his own records, because the students get like a certificate of completion for completing the module. So he started having them send him, because it's just a little digital thing that they get emailed to them. He started having them send that and they get extra, it's like some participation points or something for the course. That certainly helps. And other professors have done similar things. They'll give like extra credit points, or they'll incentivize it like it's a free pass, like you get an extra class that you can miss. So I've had professors do different things, but I don't personally assign grades to those things. The instructors for the course decide how they want to do it, and I just give them what they need to do that. So sometimes I forward them things, or I'll give them a list of who all completed the module, whatever. Yeah, I think that answers most.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in on that. I think I can't assign grades either. And one of the things that I've worked with, right away with instructors when I got here before the pandemic was saying, I want them to do something. And I also want that something to be a graded component of your class. The reason we lean kind of so heavily on reflections is because often those courses had a journaling requirement or something where I could just say, even on short notice, like what you see, the questions that we have in this session are going to be part of your class assignment. I really like how Padlet and some of these other platforms have translated that from the instructor sees it and maybe I never hear about it again unless I ask, to we can see in real time kind of who is at least putting up content, who's putting up pictures, who's typing in the chat. That's been a good way to start, moving that. But yes, always I try to assign a weight to something if I ask students to do it.
So I just wanted to throw out there Padlet. So if it's a virtual class, I pull it up. Like I tell them we're all going to look at Padlet at the end of this group work. Or if it's an in-person class, I'm usually in a space that has a projector. So I will pull Padlet up and it's like, you can see who's doing their work and who's not. So that also helps them do their work.
So yeah, there were questions about Padlet. How do you, one participant asks how you navigate the 3 board limit when you use Padlet.
My institution has paid for an account with Padlet. It's not prohibitively expensive.
And I don't use it for every class, particularly like big discussions, but I will use the same one. I'll kind of wipe the board that I use, or an instructor can make, if the board is controlled by the course instructor, then they're sometimes doing it for the first time too. But we are, it is a workaround that we need to address.
Sort of a huge question for the time we have remaining, but you both brought up the concept of vocational awe, and Kara, you said explicitly that you think a focus on the physical sort of contributes to vocational awe, and I was wondering if you could maybe go a little further into that.
Yes, I can go a little further into a very big question. So vocational awe is a term coined by Fobazi Etar, coming from a more specifically library background experience. But basically, I pulled it up for this very reason. It describes a set of ideas, values, and assumptions librarians, archivists have about themselves and the profession that results in notions that libraries or archives as institutions are inherently good, sacred notions and beyond critique. And so for me, something that I've come across, because I kind of delved into reading lots of different perspectives on vocational awe and kind of the sort of awe in the archives, and using physical sources, I have found that using physical sources, it's kind of the archival or rare book side of that idea of something being sacred. And I think when we overemphasize, I mean, one, it's just not very accessible to overemphasize physical materials, because I've worked with plenty of people that really believe that like physical is the way, it is the one true path. And I don't personally believe that, and I find that problematic. And I think that it comes from this sense of vocational awe, that overemphasis on physical sources. And then I think it also can perpetuate that. And I don't think it does us a service to kind of invite students to just be in awe of the materials we have. Certainly a degree of caution is warranted, but yeah, I feel like I'm not answering this fully very well, but I'm conscious of time.
And it is, I mean, it's the equivalent of asking the seminar question. So what do you guys think of this? It's too big, it's too open-ended. And like Kara said, I mean, a lot of students, especially if I bring in classes in early modern Europe, I know they can't read the books. So I've got to figure out something for them to do that actually makes the material approachable, instead of just kind of waving my hands over it and saying, hey, look, it's a thing. So, I mean, that's why we'll use ephemera in later periods to actually get people back to earlier ones. We'll use digital sources to help students navigate some of those, some of the things that they don't have, whether it's handwriting or language skills. But it is, in the end, it's about making them feel comfortable working with the material. If I tell them this stuff is for them and I don't let them access it, then I'm doing them and myself a disservice, really.
Well, I think you both have given all of us a lot of food for thought and ways to rethink or continue to refine how we do what we do in the classroom with the stuff, whether it's physically there or not. So thank you both for your great presentations and work, and thank you everyone for giving us part of your afternoon, and hope to see some of you for the second part of this, which we'll talk about special collections and general circulating collections. So thank you all, and have a good rest of your day.